A millionaire meets a humble farmer and is stunned to see her son. The young man looks exactly as he did 20 years ago. The sleepy town of Redwood Valley buzzed with rare excitement. A stranger had arrived, one who didn't blend in with the local farmers and shopkeepers. Graham Whitmore's black sedan rolled down the dusty main street, catching eyes and whispers as it went. Redwood Valley rarely saw people like him, successful, wealthy, and clearly out of place in his tailored suit and polished shoes. Word traveled fast, and within hours nearly everyone in town knew the name: Graham Whitmore. Nora Campbell heard the news from Mrs. Jenkins, the town's grocer, who was always quick to catch every scrap of gossip. "They say he's some big shot from the city," Mrs. Jenkins had said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Came all this way to buy up land. Real estate, they say, looking to expand his business." Nora had nodded, though her heart had skipped a beat. She'd lived here her entire life, raising her son, Eli, alone and maintaining her small but thriving farm. The thought of some city slicker buying up land worried her. She'd worked too hard to lose what she had built. As the day wore on, Nora couldn't shake the thought of the new arrival. Redwood Valley was her safe haven, far removed from the complexities of the world outside. Life here was about sunrises over wheat fields, hard work, and the simple but fulfilling act of building something with her own two hands. The notion of a wealthy businessman strolling in and disrupting everything irked her. Later that afternoon, she spotted the man himself standing outside the town's cafe, talking to a couple of locals who looked as though they had no idea what to make of him. He was tall, with graying hair and a face that seemed both kind and worn. She wondered what secrets lay behind his polished exterior. Curiosity got the better of her, and before she could second-guess herself, she had crossed the street to get a better look. But as she approached, he turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that startled her. She froze, unsure if it was the surprise of being caught staring or something else. Something unspoken that lingered in the air between them. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice warm and surprisingly sincere. "I don't believe we've met." Nora's walls went up instantly. She offered a nod but kept her tone polite, careful not to reveal too much. "No, we haven't. But I hear you're looking to buy land around here." His eyebrows raised, a glint of amusement flashing in his eyes. "News travels fast in Redwood Valley, doesn't it?" "It does," she replied curtly, hoping her clipped tone would discourage further conversation. But to her surprise, Graham seemed unfazed. He extended his hand. "Graham Whitmore, and you are?" Reluctantly, she shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip. "Nora Campbell." His gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, she sensed that he was taking in more than just her name. Something about the way he looked at her made her uncomfortable, as if he could see parts of her she'd rather keep hidden. Without another word, she withdrew her hand and stepped back. "If you're thinking of buying up land around here, I hope you understand that this is a tight-knit community," she said, her voice steady. "We don't take kindly to strangers changing things just because they have money." Graham chuckled, a sound that was surprisingly genuine. "I assure you, Ms. Campbell, I'm not here to disrupt anything. Just looking for a bit of peace and maybe a fresh start." A fresh start. The phrase caught her off guard. People didn't just uproot their lives for no reason. But whatever his reasons, she wasn't about to get tangled up in them. Nora had enough on her plate: her farm, her son, and the scars she kept buried from a life she'd once thought would be very different. "Good luck, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice a little softer now. "Redwood Valley can be a good place for those who respect it." With a polite nod, she turned and walked away, feeling his gaze linger on her back as she went. Part of her was curious to look back, to see if he was still watching her, but she resisted the urge. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her like that, with genuine interest and maybe even a hint of admiration. She wasn't sure if she liked it or if it unsettled her. As she made her way home, thoughts of Graham Whitmore drifted in and out of her mind. She knew she shouldn't be so affected by a stranger's arrival, but there was something about him, something that didn't quite fit with the wealthy businessman image she'd formed in her head. Maybe he was different, or maybe he was just like all the others who thought they could swoop in and take whatever they wanted. Redwood Valley had a way of revealing people's true selves, and if Graham Whitmore planned to stay, he'd have to learn that some things in life couldn't be bought. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of early autumn day that hinted at winter's approach. Nora went about her morning chores, determined to shake off the lingering thoughts of Graham Whitmore. She worked in the barn, feeding the horses and chickens, reminding herself that she didn't have time to dwell on city men with mysterious pasts. Just as she finished hauling a bucket of water for the animals, she heard footsteps on the gravel outside. She looked up, squinting against the sunlight, to see none other than Graham himself, standing at the edge of her property. "Miss Campbell," he greeted, tipping his head. "I hope I'm not intruding." Nora tensed, wiping her hands on her jeans as she approached him. "What brings you out here, Mr. Whitmore? This isn't exactly a tourist spot." He smiled, and though it was subtle, she caught a flicker of something regret, maybe, or even a sense of longing. "I'm interested in purchasing some land nearby," he explained. "I was told you'd be a good person to talk to." "Me?" Nora raised an eyebrow, unsure of why anyone would send him to her. "I'm not looking to sell, Mr. Whitmore." "Not at all," he said quickly. "I simply wanted some insight. You've been here all your life, haven't you? You know the land and the people better than anyone." She folded her arms, skeptical but intrigued. "Why do you care about what I think?" Graham hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because I've found that listening to people who know what they're doing is often the best way to learn," he said finally, his voice softer. "And I get the sense that you're someone worth listening to." Nora felt her defenses waver ever so slightly. There was sincerity in his tone that didn't seem rehearsed. "Fine," she said, setting her shoulders back. "What is it you want to know?" As they walked through her property, she explained the history of the land, the unique challenges of farming in the valley, and the importance of community. Graham listened intently, asking questions that revealed a depth of curiosity she hadn't expected. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, where Nora felt almost comfortable in his presence. "Why Redwood Valley?" she asked, breaking the silence as they paused by the old oak tree that had stood on her property since before she was born. "I mean, a man like you, surely you have other places you could go." Graham's gaze shifted, and for a moment, she saw a vulnerability that made her feel like they weren't so different after all. "Maybe I'm looking for a bit of peace myself," he admitted. "Somewhere far from the chaos, where things are simpler." The way he said it, with that hint of weariness, struck a chord in Nora. She knew all too well the feeling of wanting to escape a past that seemed determined to follow. She glanced away, suddenly uncomfortable with the direction of her thoughts. "Well," she said briskly, pushing those emotions down, "Redwood Valley is a good place for that. But you'll need more than just money to make it here. People don't take kindly to outsiders buying up land without understanding what they're getting into." Graham nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the rolling fields beyond her property. "I'm starting to understand that," he replied. "Maybe that's part of why I'm here, to see if I can earn a place in this town, to be part of something real." There was a quiet determination in his voice that unsettled her. She had been prepared to brush him off, to let him be just another wealthy passerby who came and went without a second thought. But now, looking at him, she felt the stirrings of something she couldn't quite place, something that reminded her of the person she had been years ago, before life had taught her to be wary. "Well, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone softening despite herself, "if you're serious about staying, you might find Redwood Valley can be more than just a fresh start." They fell into a comfortable silence as they walked back to the farmhouse. It had been a long time since Nora had allowed herself to talk like this, to let someone in even just a little. And despite her reservations, there was something about Graham that felt safe, different. As they reached the front of the house, Graham paused, looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something unspoken. "Thank you, Nora," he said, his voice gentle, "for giving me a chance to understand." She nodded, her defenses slipping further than she intended. "Don't thank me yet. Redwood Valley has a way of testing people's resolve. Let's see if you're still here come winter." He laughed, a genuine warm sound that seemed to settle in her bones. She found herself smiling in response, despite her best efforts to keep her distance. He nodded in farewell and turned to leave, but she sensed that this wasn't the last she would see of Graham Whitmore. As he walked away, she felt a mixture of emotions swirling inside her: curiosity, wariness, and perhaps a small spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. She knew she should guard her heart, that she'd learned long ago what happened when she let someone in. But something about Graham felt different, as if he were carrying his own scars, his own reasons for seeking out a place like Redwood Valley. With a sigh, she pushed those thoughts aside and headed back inside. She couldn't afford to get swept up in the mystery of a man she barely knew, no matter how kind his eyes were or how genuine his words had seemed. But even as she went about her day, Nora couldn't quite shake the memory of their conversation or the way his gaze had lingered on her, as if he saw something worth staying for. Over the following weeks, Graham became a familiar face around Redwood Valley, and it seemed that everywhere Nora went, he was nearby. Whether he was picking up supplies at the feed store or grabbing a coffee at the cafe, she found herself running into him, and each encounter chipped away at the walls she'd built around herself. One late afternoon, as she worked in the barn sorting through bales of hay, she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to find Graham leaning casually against the barn door, a small, almost sheepish smile on his face. "Thought I'd come by and see if you needed a hand," he offered. Nora crossed her arms, unable to hide her amused smirk. "A city man wanting to get his hands dirty? That's a first." Graham chuckled, stepping into the barn. "I'll have you know, I'm no stranger to hard work. I may wear suits these days, but there was a time I had my fair share of bruised knuckles and calloused hands." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued but skeptical. "Oh, really? And what happened to that version of you?" "Life happened," he replied, his tone a touch more serious. "And maybe I just lost sight of things, got caught up in a world that wasn't really mine." Something in his voice resonated with her, and without thinking, she tossed him a pair of gloves. "All right, Mr. Whitmore, let's see if you're as tough as you say." He laughed, pulling on the gloves and joining her in stacking the hay bales. She expected him to fumble or complain, but he worked steadily beside her, his movements sure and focused. There was something comforting in the rhythm of working side by side, and for the first time in a long while, Nora felt herself relax in the presence of another person. As they worked, they talked about little things: the changing weather, the crops, the upcoming harvest. But gradually, the conversation shifted to more personal topics. Graham shared stories of his life before his success, painting a picture of a man who'd built himself from the ground up, yet felt out of place in the world he now occupied. "I suppose that's why I came here," he admitted, pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow. "I wanted to remember what it felt like to work for something real, something that can't just be bought." Nora nodded, understanding all too well. It's hard to find that nowadays. Everything's about what you can gain, what you can own. People forget the satisfaction of building something with their own two hands. They fell silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Nora wondered if Graham felt as much a stranger to himself as she sometimes did. Life had a way of wearing people down, of changing them in ways they couldn't always recognize. As they finished stacking the last bale, Nora took off her gloves and looked over at him. "Not bad, Whitmore. You managed to keep up." He grinned, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Glad I passed the test." There was a spark in his expression. something that made her pulse quicken. And for the briefest of moments, she wondered what it would be like to let herself care for someone again. But just as quickly, she pushed the thought aside. She couldn't afford to get swept up in another man's charm, not when her past had already taught her that men like Graham, men with money and power, were dangerous to trust. Graham seemed to sense her hesitation and took a step back, his gaze softening. "Thank you for letting me help, Nora. It was nice, feeling useful." She nodded, unsure of what to say. It had been nice, too, having someone to talk to, someone who listened without judgment. But admitting that felt like crossing a line she wasn't ready for. As Graham turned to leave, he paused, looking over his shoulder. "If you ever need another hand, you know where to find me." With that, he left, and Nora watched him walk down the dirt path, his figure fading against the orange glow of the setting sun. A part of her wanted to call him back, to keep talking, to know more about the man behind the suit and the past he carried. But she forced herself to stay put, telling herself that she couldn't afford to get involved. Still, the days continued to pass, and each time Graham appeared, Nora found herself looking forward to their exchanges. She'd see him around town, always with a friendly nod or a quick joke, something to remind her of the connection they were building. One evening, he invited her to join him for a casual dinner at the cafe, a simple gesture that felt surprisingly meaningful. They sat at a corner booth, talking and laughing over plates of pie and cups of coffee, as if they were just two ordinary people with no history, no baggage. "What brought you to Redwood Valley in the first place?" she asked, genuinely curious. Graham hesitated, then looked down at his coffee, the warmth fading from his face. "A need for something real. My life got complicated. I guess I just wanted to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard, and she felt a pang of empathy she hadn't expected. "Everyone deserves a place to call home," she said softly. "A place that feels like it's yours." He looked up at her, his gaze piercing yet gentle. "And what about you, Nora? Do you feel at home here?" She paused, the question hanging between them. Redwood Valley was the only place she'd ever known, but sometimes she felt like a stranger in her own life, caught between the past and the present. She nodded, even though a part of her wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "At least I try to." They sat in silence, each wrapped in their own thoughts. For the first time in a long time, Nora felt like someone truly saw her, understood the parts of herself she kept hidden. And as they left the cafe that night, walking side by side under the stars, she felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility she hadn't dared to imagine. But as they reached her door, reality sank back in. She couldn't let herself believe in possibilities, not when her past was still so close, so ready to resurface. Graham might be different, but he was still a man with a life she could never fully understand. "Thank you, Graham," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "For tonight." He nodded, his expression one of understanding. "Anytime, Nora." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Nora standing in the doorway, a strange mixture of comfort and fear settling over her heart. The chill of early autumn settled over Redwood Valley, and the leaves had started turning to warm shades of red and orange. Nora spent her days preparing the farm for the coming winter, her mind constantly drifting back to her encounters with Graham. She'd tried to focus on her work and her son, Eli, but there was no denying the growing connection she felt with him. It was subtle, but every encounter chipped away at the walls she'd so carefully built. One evening, while Nora was out tending to the livestock, Eli decided to clean up the attic, a task he knew his mother had put off for years. Boxes of old memories lay gathering dust, remnants of a past his mother rarely spoke about. As he sifted through the piles, he stumbled upon a small, weathered wooden box tucked away beneath old blankets. Curiosity got the best of him, and he opened the box to find a stack of letters, their edges yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant, with Nora's name written on each envelope in a script Eli didn't recognize. His heart quickened as he realized these letters weren't simply forgotten scraps. They were something his mother had kept hidden. As he unfolded the first letter, Eli's breath caught. The letter was addressed to his mother from a man named Graham. He read on, each line revealing glimpses of a romance he'd never known his mother had. The words painted a picture of two young people in love, full of passion and promise. But as he read further, he sensed the heartbreak woven into the lines, the lingering sorrow that had marked his mother's life. The realization hit him like a punch, his father. These letters might reveal the truth about the man he had never known. Growing up, he had asked Nora about his father only a few times, but she'd always brushed off his questions, telling him that his father had left before he was born. Now, with these letters in hand, he realized there was so much more she hadn't told him. He continued reading, letter after letter, piecing together fragments of his mother's past. Some letters were hopeful, full of dreams and plans for the future. Others were tinged with sorrow, as if something had come between them, something that had shattered their hopes. But it was the last letter that left him stunned. A brief note in which the man Graham had promised to find a way back to her no matter what. Heart-pounding, Eli placed the letters back in the box, his mind racing. Could it be? Could this Graham be the same man his mother had been talking to lately? The man who'd been showing up at the farm, helping her with the chores, and looking at her with something akin to admiration? A storm of emotions churned within him, confusion, betrayal, anger. How could she have hidden this from him all these years? When Nora came back into the house, she found Eli sitting at the kitchen table, the box of letters open in front of him. The look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He'd found them. Her heart sank, and she steeled herself, knowing this conversation was long overdue. "Eli," she began, her voice shaky, unsure of where to start. "Is it true?" he interrupted, his voice a mixture of hurt and accusation. "Is this Graham, my father?" Nora swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached for the chair across from him. She had dreaded this moment for years, knowing that one day Eli would demand answers she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "Yes," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Graham is your father." The words hung heavy in the air, and Nora could see the hurt in Eli's eyes. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, the mother he'd trusted and admired, now a stranger holding secrets he hadn't thought possible. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice rising. "All these years I asked you about him and you lied to me. Why?" Nora's eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I didn't lie, Eli. I protected you. When I found out I was pregnant, Graham was gone. I didn't know where he was or if he'd ever come back. I thought it was best to move on, to give you a stable life without the confusion of a man who wasn't there." Eli clenched his fists, struggling to contain the emotions boiling within him. "You had no right to decide that for me. I had a right to know where I came from, who my father was." Nora felt her own anger rising, though she tried to keep it in check. "I did what I thought was best, Eli. I didn't want you to grow up wondering about a man who might never have returned. I made that choice to protect you." He shook his head, standing up so abruptly that the chair scraped against the floor. "And now he's back, isn't he? Just like that, he shows up, and you just pretend like everything's fine?" Nora opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. How could she explain the years of heartache, the hope she'd clung to, and the eventual acceptance that Graham would never come back? How could she make Eli understand her own loneliness, the weight of secrets kept in the name of love? Eli grabbed the box of letters, his expression unreadable as he walked to the door. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Mom," he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. Before she could stop him, he was gone, leaving her standing in the quiet kitchen with only the echoes of their argument lingering in the air. Nora sank into the chair, her heart breaking at the pain in his voice. She'd thought she was protecting him. shielding him from the mistakes of her past. But now, it seemed her silence had only driven a wedge between them. The night wore on, and Nora sat alone, wrestling with the guilt that had surfaced with Eli's discovery. She'd done her best to give him a stable life, but now she wondered if she'd been wrong. Had her choice to keep him in the dark been a mistake? And if so, how could she ever make it right? As the hours passed, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't undo the past. But with Graham back in her life, perhaps there was a chance to bring some truth to the present. It was time to face the secrets she'd hidden, and if possible mend the bond with her son before it was too late. The following morning, Nora went through her chores in a haze, her mind clouded with thoughts of Eli and the argument they'd had. The kitchen felt emptier than ever, and she couldn't shake the hollow ache in her chest. She knew she'd have to face Graham eventually, but she wasn't prepared for how soon that confrontation would come. As she loaded a crate of vegetables onto her truck, she heard the familiar crunch of gravel underfoot. She looked up, and there was Eli, striding across the yard with a stormy look in his eyes. But he wasn't alone. Graham was right behind him, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Eli," she began, her voice faltering. "Mom, we're done with secrets," Eli said firmly, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it. He turned to Graham, who looked from Nora to Eli with a mix of bewilderment and apprehension. "This man deserves to know the truth, and I deserve to hear it all. No more lies." Nora felt her heart sink as she looked between the two of them. This was the moment she'd feared, the one she'd tried to avoid for so long. Taking a deep breath, she nodded, motioning for them to sit on the porch steps. The three of them sat down, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. Graham looked at her, his brows furrowed. "Nora, what's going on?" Nora met his gaze, her eyes filled with emotions she could barely contain. "Graham, there's something I never told you. When you left, She paused, her voice catching. "I was pregnant. With Eli." Graham's face went pale, and he leaned back, as if trying to absorb the weight of her words. He looked at Eli, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You're my son?" Eli's jaw clenched, anger flashing in his eyes. "Yeah, and all these years you never bothered to come back. Not for my mom, not for me." Graham turned back to Nora, his voice shaking. "I didn't know, Nora. I swear I would have come back if I'd known. But what happened? Why didn't you tell me?" Nora took a shaky breath, the memories flooding back like a tide she couldn't control. "I wrote to you, Graham. I tried to reach you, but my letters came back unopened. I thought you'd abandoned me, that you'd moved on. I didn't want to raise Eli on broken promises, so I decided to do it on my own." Graham's face darkened as he processed her words, his fists clenching. "Nora, I never got those letters. Not a single one. My family. They told me you'd left me, that you'd moved away without a word. I was devastated, but I thought..." He paused, anger and betrayal simmering in his voice. "I thought you didn't want me anymore." Nora felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. "They told you that?" He nodded, his jaw tight with frustration. "Yes, and I believed them. I was young, stupid, and I thought maybe they were right, that you'd outgrown me. So I tried to move on, tried to bury it all." The realization struck Nora like a punch. All those years of pain, anger, and regret. And it had all been based on lies, a deliberate act by his family to keep them apart. She glanced at Eli, whose expression was unreadable, though the tension in his shoulders was clear. Eli's voice broke the silence, cold and filled with years of pent-up resentment. "So what now? You show up here, all these years later, thinking you can just walk back into our lives? I don't need a father who only shows up when it's convenient." Graham flinched, his face etched with remorse. "Eli, I know I can't change the past. I can't take back the years we lost, but I want to be here now for you, for your mother. If you'll let me." Eli crossed his arms, his face hard. "I don't even know you, and I don't know if I want to." Nora felt her heart twist as she watched her son's pain spill out in each word. She placed a hand on his shoulder, hoping to soothe him, but he shook it off, standing up abruptly. "I need some air." Without another word, he walked off, leaving her and Graham alone on the porch. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken feelings, 1,000 emotions battling between them. Graham let out a long breath, his gaze focused on the horizon. "Nora, I don't even know where to begin. I'm sorry doesn't seem nearly enough." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say either. I thought I'd moved on, but seeing you again, it's like I'm back in that place, wondering what happened, wondering why you didn't come back." He reached for her hand, hesitating before he finally clasped it gently. "They lied to us, Nora. My family, they wanted to keep us apart. I was too naive to see it back then, but I'm here now, and I don't want to lose you again. Not if there's a chance we can start over." Nora looked down, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, sorrow, and a hint of hope. "I don't know if it's that simple, Graham. So much has happened. Eli, he's all I've known for so long. I don't want to hurt him any more than he already has been." Graham's grip tightened, his voice earnest. "I don't want to hurt him either. I just want a chance to be the father he deserves, to be there for him in a way I couldn't be before. But I know it's not my decision alone." Nora felt the weight of his words and the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of a life with him, of healing the wounds they both carried. But she also knew that Eli's trust was fragile, and any misstep could break it for good. "We'll take it slow," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "If you're serious about this, about us, then you need to earn his trust, and mine." Graham nodded, relief and determination flashing in his gaze. "I'll do whatever it takes, Nora. I mean it." They sat there side by side, watching the morning sun rise over Redwood Valley. There was no guarantee that things would turn out as they hoped, no certainty that the damage could be undone. But in that quiet moment, with the warmth of his hand in hers, Nora allowed herself a sliver of hope, a fragile, cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new. But as they watched Eli disappear over the hill, she knew their journey had only just begun. Graham would have to prove himself, not only to her, but to the son he'd unknowingly left behind, and she would have to confront the remnants of the past that haunted them both. As the sun climbed higher, Nora leaned against Graham, a quiet determination settling within her. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next few days passed slowly, each one weighted with a quiet tension that seemed to linger in the air around the farmhouse. Eli had grown distant, avoiding both Nora and Graham as he tried to process the revelations that had upended his world. He spent hours wandering through the fields or helping other local farmers, anything to escape the turbulent emotions that threatened to boil over. Graham, meanwhile, wrestled with his own guilt and frustration, knowing now that his family had manipulated him, severing the bond he had with Nora, filled him with a bitter sense of betrayal. He needed to find answers, to confront those responsible for the years he'd lost, and the pain he had unwittingly caused both Nora and Eli. One evening, as the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, Graham sat alone in the town's only pub, nursing a drink as he mulled over his next steps. The place was mostly empty, save for a few regulars who offered nods of acknowledgement but kept their distance. He was grateful for the solitude, for the chance to sift through his thoughts in the dim, quiet room. Just as he was finishing his drink, his phone buzzed, the caller ID displaying a name he hadn't seen in months, his cousin, Ethan. He hadn't spoken to Ethan in a long time, and part of him felt a pang of dread at the sight of his name. Reluctantly, he answered, his voice taut. Ethan. Graham, Ethan replied, his voice guarded. I heard you're back in touch with her. Her? Graham's jaw clenched, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Her name is Nora, and yes, I'm back in Redwood Valley. Is there a reason you're calling? There was a pause on the other end, as if Ethan were carefully choosing his words. You should be careful, Graham. There are things about the past that are better left alone. Graham's patience snapped. Better left alone? You and the rest of the family lied to me, kept Nora and me apart. I found out I have a son I never got the chance to know. And you're telling me it's better left alone? A sigh came through the line, and Ethan's tone softened. Look, Graham, it wasn't my decision alone. The family thought. They thought you were making a mistake, that she wasn't right for you. They believed they were protecting you. Protecting me. Graham's voice was low, filled with bitterness. All you did was rob me of the life I wanted, of the family I could have had. Another silence, and then, it's more complicated than you think, Graham. There were other factors, family interests, financial matters. Our grandfather was particularly insistent. He saw Nora as a liability. Graham's grip on the phone tightened, the weight of betrayal settling over him like a dark cloud. He'd always known his family was ruthless when it came to preserving their wealth and reputation, but he'd never imagined they would go so far as to destroy his happiness. Liability? He repeated, his voice shaking. Nora was never anything but good to me. She was the best thing that ever happened to me, and you all tore us apart over money. Graham, Ethan warned, his voice uneasy. I'm just telling you what happened. I don't expect you to understand, but our family has a certain image to uphold. You were supposed to follow a different path. Graham felt a surge of anger rise within him, fierce and consuming. I've had enough of the family's image, Ethan. I'm done with all of it. Nora and Eli, they're my family now, not the Whitmores and their empty legacy. He ended the call, his hands shaking as he set the phone down on the bar. The enormity of what he'd uncovered filled him with a hollow ache. All these years, he'd been lied to, his own future stolen from him by people he'd once trusted. And for what? Money? Reputation? A twisted sense of loyalty? Graham knew what he had to do. He would go to Nora, tell her everything he'd learned. She deserved the truth, all of it. And Eli Graham needed to show him that he was here to stay, that he wouldn't let the mistakes of the past continue to cast their shadow over their lives. The next morning he drove to Nora's farmhouse, arriving just as she was finishing up with the morning chores. She looked up, a mixture of surprise and caution in her gaze as he approached. Graham, she said, brushing a stray piece of hay from her shoulder. What brings you here so early? He took a deep breath, steeling himself. There's something you need to know, Nora, about my family, about why I never came back. Her expression shifted, the caution giving way to something darker, more wary. Go on. They sat on the porch, the quiet of the morning surrounding them. Graham recounted his conversation with Ethan, explaining how his family had conspired to keep them apart, labeling Nora as a liability, and manipulating him into believing she'd left of her own accord. With every word, he saw the pain and disbelief etched into her face, and it tore at him to know he was reopening old wounds. When he finished, she sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. So that's it then? Your family decided I wasn't good enough for you, and you believed them. Graham shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. I was young and naive, Nora. I thought they had my best interests at heart. But I was wrong, and I'll never forgive myself for letting them come between us. Nora's gaze hardened, and he could see the years of hurt reflected in her eyes. Do you have any idea what it was like, raising Eli on my own, watching him grow up without a father, knowing he'd never have the answers he deserved. Graham's shoulders slumped, guilt washing over him in waves. I can't change the past, Nora. I wish I could, but all I can do is be here now, to be the father Eli needs and to prove to you that I'm committed to making things right. She looked away, her jaw clenched. He could sense the battle within her, the pull between the memories of the man she'd once loved and the bitterness of his absence. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice soft but resolute. I don't know if I can trust you, Graham. After everything, it's hard to just forget. He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm here for you, for Eli, for as long as you'll have me. As they sat in silence, Graham felt a glimmer of hope, fragile and uncertain but real. He knew there were no easy fixes, no simple path to redemption. But for the first time, he felt that perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way forward together, as a family. Just then, the door opened, and Eli stepped out onto the porch, his gaze falling on both of them. There was a guardedness in his eyes, a barrier Graham wasn't sure how to cross. Mom, Eli said, his voice steady. Is he telling the truth? Nora looked at Graham, then back at Eli, her voice filled with quiet strength. Yes, Eli. He's telling the truth. As painful as it is, he's not hiding anything. Eli regarded his father with a mixture of suspicion and yearning, the conflicting emotions clear in his eyes. Then prove it, Graham. Don't just say you're here for us. Show us. Show me you're not like the rest of them. Graham met his son's gaze, a sense of purpose flooding through him. I will, Eli, I promise. As the morning sun rose over Redwood Valley, there was a sense of something shifting, a fragile but real connection beginning to form. And for the first time in years, Graham felt that he was right where he belonged. The days following their conversation passed with a delicate sense of hope, though tension still lingered. Graham stayed around the farmhouse, determined to prove his sincerity to both Nora and Eli. He began helping with chores, fixing things around the property that had long been neglected. Though it wasn't much, he hoped each small effort would show his commitment. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept over the valley, Graham found himself in the barn repairing a broken fence rail. The familiar sounds of roosters crowing and horses shuffling in their stalls filled the air. He took a deep breath, savoring the simplicity of the moment. There was a strange peace here, unlike anything he'd known in his life in the city. As he hammered the rail back into place, he noticed Eli watching him from the barn entrance, his arms crossed. Graham paused, setting down the hammer and straightening up. Morning, Eli, he greeted, forcing a calmness into his voice that he didn't quite feel. Eli nodded, though he didn't step closer. I didn't expect to see you here so early, he muttered, his tone cautious. Graham shrugged, trying to keep things casual. Figured I'd get a head start. Your mom mentioned this fence has needed fixing for a while. They stood in an awkward silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Eli shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flitting between the fence and his father. Finally, he cleared his throat. You don't have to do all this, you know. Graham met his eyes, sensing the vulnerability beneath Eli's guarded expression. I want to, he replied simply. I missed out on a lot, and I can't change that. But I can be here now, help out in any way I can. Eli watched him for a moment, his jaw tight. I don't know what you expect from me. I spent my whole life without a father, and now you're just here. Graham's heart ached at the frustration in Eli's voice. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but he knew he had to tread carefully. I know, Eli. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I know I have to earn that. But I'm here because I want to be, and I'm not going anywhere. Eli's expression softened ever so slightly, and he looked down, his hands fidgeting. "It's strange, you know. Having you here, I can imagine," Graham replied quietly. "I'm trying to find my place here, too." For a brief moment, Eli's defenses seemed to lower, and Graham felt a glimmer of connection, a fragile thread between them. But just as quickly, Eli's guard went back up, and he muttered a quick, "I'd better get back to work," before heading toward the fields. Graham watched him go, a mixture of hope and heartache stirring within him. It was progress, however small, and he clung to it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, they could begin to bridge the years of separation. Over the following days, Graham continued to immerse himself in life on the farm, learning the routines and rhythms that had defined Nora and Eli's lives for so long. He joined Nora in the fields, helping her gather crops and preparing the barn for the winter months ahead. He realized how much she had sacrificed, how tirelessly she'd worked to provide for Eli and keep the farm running. Watching her move with such quiet strength filled him with admiration, and he felt a pang of guilt for the years she'd faced alone. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the barn, Nora glanced at him with a look of curiosity. "So, Mr. City Man," she said, a hint of a smile in her voice. "You think you're ready for the Redwood Valley life?" Graham chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "I think I'm finally getting the hang of it. Turns out there's something satisfying about hard work." She laughed softly, and the sound was like music to his ears. "You're full of surprises, Graham." They fell into a comfortable silence as they continued their work, and Graham felt a warmth settle over him, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He looked over at her, wanting to say something, to tell her how grateful he was for this second chance, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached over, his hand covering hers as she reached for a tool. She froze, her eyes meeting his, and in that brief moment, Graham felt the years between them melt away. For a heartbeat, it was as if nothing had changed, as if they were still young and in love, untouched by the pain and separation. But just as quickly, Nora pulled her hand away, a hint of caution in her gaze. It's going to take time, Graham, for me and for Eli." He nodded, understanding the hesitation in her eyes. "I know. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I just want the chance to make things right." Nora offered him a small, sad smile. "That's all any of us can ask for." As the weeks passed, Graham and Eli began to settle into an uneasy routine. There were moments of tension, especially when old wounds resurfaced. But gradually, Graham's presence on the farm began to feel less foreign. Eli would occasionally offer a nod of acknowledgement, a small gesture that felt monumental in its simplicity. Graham took each small sign of acceptance as a victory, no matter how subtle. One day, as they worked together repairing a fence line, Eli broke the silence with an unexpected question. "So, what's it like? The life you had before you came here?" Graham hesitated, surprised by the question. It was different. A lot of it was spent chasing things that didn't really matter. Success, wealth, all those things they tell you are important. Eli listened, his face unreadable. "So why give it all up?" Graham looked at his son, his voice soft. "Because none of it means anything if you're alone. I spent years trying to fill an emptiness I didn't understand. But being here, with you and your mother, it feels like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Eli was silent, his expression thoughtful. Though he didn't respond, Graham sensed that his words had reached him in some small way. As the sun set over the fields that evening, Nora joined them outside, a quiet smile on her face as she watched father and son working together. She could see the changes in both of them, the guarded looks that had softened, the tentative steps toward trust. It was a fragile piece, but it was something, a foundation on which they could build. They gathered around the kitchen table that night, sharing a meal in comfortable silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nora allowed herself to hope. to believe that maybe, against all odds, they could find a way forward as a family. But even as they laughed and shared stories, she felt a pang of worry tugging at her heart. The past was still there, a shadow that loomed over them, and she knew that any misstep could shatter the fragile bond they were building. Yet as she looked at Graham and Eli, both of them finally showing the beginnings of acceptance, she knew that the journey was worth the risk. They had come this far, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt a quiet strength within her, a determination to face whatever challenges lay ahead side by side. The autumn days grew shorter, and a chill settled over Redwood Valley as winter approached. On the surface, life on the farm seemed almost peaceful, with Graham, Nora, and Eli falling into a rhythm of shared chores and quiet moments. But beneath that fragile calm, tension simmered, especially between Eli and his father. Eli tried to let down his guard, but the years of hurt and unanswered questions made it hard for him to trust fully. Then, one morning, while Nora and Graham were out tending to the livestock, Eli returned from an errand in town looking troubled. In his hand was a letter, sealed with the Whitmore family crest, and his face held a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He turned the envelope over, studying it as though it might offer some hidden meaning. Later that day, when he was alone, he finally opened it. Inside was a neatly folded letter, written in an unfamiliar but elegant script. Eli's eyes scanned the first lines, his pulse quickening as he absorbed the contents. The letter was from a member of the Whitmore family, a distant uncle named Charles, whom he'd never met but had heard mentioned in passing. Charles wrote with apparent warmth and concern, expressing interest in finally meeting Eli and extending an invitation to visit. But the more Eli read, the more he sensed an underlying agenda. There was an unmistakable tone of persuasion woven through the words, urging him to consider his rightful place within the Whitmore legacy. The letter mentioned a potential inheritance, suggesting that he could claim a portion of the family fortune, something he'd never even considered. Eli's mind raced with questions, torn between intrigue and suspicion. The next day, while working in the fields with Graham, Eli finally worked up the courage to mention the letter. "I got something in the mail yesterday," he began, keeping his tone casual but watching his father carefully. "From a man named Charles Whitmore." Graham stopped, his face darkening at the mention of the name. "Charles? My uncle." He paused, visibly unsettled. What did he want? Eli hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "He invited me to visit, said he wanted to meet me, and told me I have a rightful place in the family." Graham's jaw tightened, and he shook his head, a look of frustration crossing his face. "Eli, I don't think you should trust anything Charles says. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Charles has always been more concerned with the family's image than with people's well-being. He's one of the people who kept me from coming back to your mother." Eli felt a pang of resentment flare up. "So now I'm supposed to just ignore them? Pretend they don't exist?" Graham met his gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking you to be careful, Eli. They see you as part of their legacy, a Whitmore. But it's not about you. It's about them keeping control of everything they hold dear. You're just another piece on their board." Eli clenched his fists, his expression hardening. "I don't know, Graham. You kept me out of your life for all these years, and now you expect me to believe everything you say about them?" Graham's shoulders slumped, a look of hurt flickering across his face. "I understand why you're angry, Eli, and I can't blame you for questioning me. But trust me when I say that Charles and the rest of them don't have your best interests at heart. They'll use you if it serves their purpose." The conversation left Eli with a bitter taste, a mix of resentment and confusion swirling inside him. He didn't know what to believe, but he felt an undeniable pull to understand the side of his heritage that had been hidden from him. The idea of claiming his place in the Whitmore legacy was tempting, especially after feeling like an outsider in his own family for so long. That evening, he found himself alone on the porch, watching the stars as he mulled over his options. He wanted to trust Graham, but his father's absence for all those years had left scars, and the offer from Charles felt like an opportunity to claim something he'd been denied his whole life. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the invitation came with strings attached. The following week, another letter arrived from Charles, this one more assertive. It hinted at potential consequences if Eli didn't respond, subtly pressuring him to make a choice. Confused and frustrated, Eli felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. When Nora saw the tension in his face, she tried to offer some comfort. "Whatever you decide, Eli, just remember that family isn't about money or legacy. It's about the people who are there for you, who love you." Eli gave her a nod, though he didn't say much. He was grateful for her words, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he needed to confront this part of his heritage, even if only to understand the full picture. One evening, while Graham and Nora sat in the living room after dinner, Eli walked in, his face set with determination. "I'm going to see Charles," he announced, his voice steady. Nora looked up in alarm, her eyes flashing with concern. "Eli, are you sure that's a good idea? The Whitmores have only ever caused us pain." Graham rose, crossing the room to face him. "Eli, please, they're manipulating you. I don't want to see you get hurt." But Eli shook his head, resolute. "I need to do this. I can't go on ignoring part of who I am. Maybe you're right, and maybe I'll regret it, but I have to see for myself." Reluctantly, Graham and Nora accepted his decision, though both looked troubled. They knew they couldn't stop him, but a sense of foreboding settled over them as they watched him leave. Nora reached for Graham's hand, her expression tight with worry. "We can only hope he sees the truth before they do any real damage," she murmured. Graham nodded, a look of grim determination on his face. "I won't let them take him, Nora. I'll be there every step of the way if he needs me." In the days that followed, Eli traveled to the grand Whitmore estate, a sprawling mansion that dwarfed the farmhouse where he'd grown up. Charles greeted him with open arms, all charm and sophistication, showing Eli the luxurious world that might have been his if circumstances had been different. Charles spoke of family pride, responsibility, and the importance of heritage, painting a picture that both fascinated and unnerved Eli. But as the days passed, Eli began to see cracks in the facade. There was an edge to Charles, a sense of entitlement and manipulation that grew more apparent with each passing conversation. He could feel the subtle pressure mounting, as if he were being groomed to take his rightful place within the Whitmore legacy, but at a cost he couldn't yet fully understand. Back at the farm, Graham and Nora waited anxiously, hoping Eli would return with his sense of loyalty to them intact. The farmhouse felt emptier without him, and the unease gnawed at Graham's heart. He knew how persuasive Charles could be, how easily he could twist the truth to serve his own ends. When Eli finally returned, there was a new hardness in his expression, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. Nora embraced him, relieved to have him home, but she could sense the inner conflict brewing beneath his calm exterior. As they sat around the dinner table that night, Eli spoke little, his mind clearly elsewhere. Graham wanted to ask about the visit, to offer guidance, but he held back, sensing that Eli needed space to process his experience. Finally, as the meal ended, Eli looked up, his gaze settling on his parents. "Charles, he made a lot of promises," he said slowly. "But I could see through it, the way he tried to pull me in. I don't want their world, their expectations. I'm staying here." A wave of relief washed over Nora and Graham, and they shared a look of quiet gratitude. But they both knew the Whitmores wouldn't give up so easily. The battle for Eli's loyalty wasn't over, but for now they had him back. Just as things seemed to be settling down, another letter arrived, but this time it was different. Eli found it slipped under his door early one morning, the envelope unmarked and the handwriting unrecognizable. His initial reaction was suspicion. his mind flashing back to Charles and the manipulative tactics he'd experienced at the Whitmore estate. Unfolding the letter, he found it brief but chillingly direct. Eli, you have a right to more than you realize. The Whitmore estate isn't all they're hiding from you. There's a legacy one they'll do anything to keep from you. Meet me tonight at the old Redwood Chapel if you want answers. The words ignited a mixture of anger and curiosity in him. Someone knew things that even Charles hadn't revealed, and it was tempting. So tempting to finally uncover the whole truth. He wasn't sure if he should believe it, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there were secrets lurking just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. He debated whether to tell Nora and Graham, but decided against it, unsure of how they would react. Instead, he tucked the letter into his pocket and waited until nightfall, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. As darkness fell, he slipped out of the house and made his way to the old Redwood Chapel, a long-abandoned building that had once served the small community. Its walls were weathered, and the paint had long since faded, giving it an air of eerie isolation. Eli pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the silence pressing in on him as he stepped inside. A single figure stood near the altar, cloaked in shadow. Eli's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and as he approached, he realized the man was someone he recognized. Ethan Whitmore, Graham's cousin. Eli, Ethan greeted, his voice low and steady. I wasn't sure if you'd come. Eli crossed his arms, his tone wary. Why did you bring me here? What do you know? Ethan's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps regret, in his eyes. There are things your father never knew, things our family has been hiding for years. The Whitmore fortune wasn't built cleanly. There were sacrifices made, decisions that cost people everything. Eli felt a shiver run down his spine. What kind of decisions? Ethan took a deep breath, glancing around as if making sure they were alone. Years ago, our grandfather orchestrated deals that led to the ruin of small businesses, even entire families. It's blood money, Eli, and anyone who tried to stand in his way was forced out, exiled, or worse. Your father was one of them. When he chose your mother over the family, they cut him off, manipulated him, made sure he'd lose everything. They didn't want him to tarnish the family image with someone they considered beneath them. Eli clenched his fists, anger boiling up. So all of this, everything they did to keep us apart, was because of some twisted sense of power and control. Ethan nodded, his voice filled with bitterness. They care about nothing but the family name, the fortune, and the legacy they've built on other people's suffering. And now they're after you. You represent something they don't understand, a threat to their control. Charles wanted you on his side because it would keep you under their thumb. But the truth is, they'll do anything to maintain their power. Eli felt a surge of anger and disgust. Why are you telling me this, Ethan? Aren't you part of that world? Ethan's face softened and he shook his head. I was. I tried to fit in, to live by their rules. But then I saw what they were doing, and I couldn't be part of it anymore. I stayed in touch with the family because I hoped I could keep an eye on things, maybe make amends for the harm they've caused. But the closer I got, the more I realized it was impossible. Now all I can do is try to warn you. Eli stared at him, trying to process everything. The truth settled like a heavy weight on his chest, making it hard to breathe. So what do I do? Just pretend like they don't exist? Ethan hesitated, his gaze solemn. You have two choices, Eli. You can walk away, sever any connection to the Whitmore legacy, and live your life free of them. Or you can face them, confront them, and try to claim what's rightfully yours. But if you do that, you have to be prepared for a fight. They won't let you go easily. Eli's mind raced with conflicting thoughts, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. For so long he had felt disconnected, like he was floating between two worlds, one with his mother, grounded in love and sacrifice, and another he didn't fully understand, full of wealth and power, but rooted in lies. Ethan seemed to sense his turmoil and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you choose, remember who you are, Eli. Don't let them turn you into something you're not." Eli nodded, though he wasn't sure what his next step would be. As he left the chapel, the cold night air stung his face, sharpening his resolve. He knew he couldn't ignore what he'd learned, but he also didn't want to lose the family he'd only just begun to reconnect with. When he arrived back at the farmhouse, the lights were still on, and he found both Nora and Graham waiting in the living room. Nora's face was etched with worry, and Graham looked as if he'd aged 10 years since Eli had left. "Where were you?" Graham demanded, his voice filled with a mix of anger and concern. Eli hesitated, then pulled out the anonymous letter, handing it to them. "I went to get answers." Graham scanned the letter, his jaw tightening as he read, and Nora's expression turned to one of horror as she glanced between her son and Graham. "Eli, why didn't you tell us?" "I didn't know if you'd understand," Eli replied, his voice soft but steady. "I had to know what I was dealing with. I couldn't just ignore it." Graham placed the letter on the table, his eyes filled with regret. "I should have warned you about them sooner. I didn't want you to have to face this part of my life, of our family. But I see now that you have the right to know." Eli looked at his father, a mix of anger and empathy swirling inside him. "I understand why you left them, but now they're trying to pull me in, and I don't know if I can keep walking away." Nora moved closer, her hand resting on Eli's arm. "Whatever you choose, Eli, we're here with you. You're not alone in this." Graham nodded, a fierce determination in his eyes. "If they want to drag you into their world, they'll have to go through me first. I won't let them hurt you, or use you like they tried to use me." Eli took a deep breath, the weight of his decision settling on him. He looked at both of them, a sense of clarity emerging from the chaos. "Then we'll face them together," he said firmly. "I'm done letting them control us. It's time they see what real family loyalty looks like." As the three of them sat together, united in their resolve, Eli felt the first spark of something new, an unbreakable bond, forged from both the pain of the past and the strength of the love they'd found again. As winter crept closer, the winds blowing through Redwood Valley carried a sharper chill. The farmhouse was filled with a tense anticipation, each of them feeling the weight of the impending confrontation. Together, they prepared for what lay ahead, knowing the Whitmore family wouldn't back down without a fight. One frosty morning, Graham received a formal letter from Charles, cold and calculated, demanding that Eli appear at the Whitmore estate. The letter was filled with legal jargon, hinting at possible repercussions if Eli refused to cooperate. The words were veiled threats, an attempt to intimidate them into submission. But this time, Graham was prepared. He knew how his family operated, and he was determined to protect Nora and Eli. They spent hours each day strategizing, talking through every possible outcome, preparing for the fight that awaited them. The day of the confrontation arrived under a gray sky, clouds heavy with the promise of snow. Together they drove to the Whitmore estate, the imposing mansion looming on the horizon as they approached. Graham could feel his heart pounding, each beat filled with years of unresolved anger and betrayal. Nora reached over, squeezing his hand, her silent support a steadying presence. They entered the grand hall where Charles and several other family members waited, their faces masks of indifference and superiority. Charles stepped forward, his expression a mixture of disdain and thinly veiled hostility. "So," Charles began, his tone icy, "you've finally decided to return to where you belong, Graham. And I see you've brought guests." Graham stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to rejoin the family, Charles. I'm here to put an end to this once and for all. Eli deserves to know the truth, and he deserves a life free from your control." Charles's eyes shifted to Eli, sizing him up with a calculating stare. "Eli, you have a choice to make. Your father threw away his legacy, his birthright, for the life of a nobody. But you don't have to make the same mistake. You could inherit everything the Whitmores have built, the wealth and the power that are rightfully yours. Eli felt the weight of Charles's gaze, a mixture of contempt and persuasion. I don't care about your money or your legacy, he replied, his voice steady. I'm here because I refuse to let you manipulate me like you did my father. Charles's expression hardened, his lips curling into a sneer. And you think you're better off with these people? People who are beneath us, who have nothing to offer. Nora took a step forward, her eyes fierce. This family has shown Eli what real loyalty and love look like. You can keep your money. We don't need it, and neither does he. A ripple of whispers spread among the other family members, but Charles held his ground, his face a mask of cold rage. You're making a grave mistake, Eli. You don't understand the sacrifices that have been made for this family, the lengths we've gone to protect our legacy. This estate, this power, it's your birthright. Eli met his gaze, unflinching. I do understand. You tore apart people's lives to build your empire. People like my mother and father. That's not a legacy I want to be a part of. Charles's demeanor shifted, a glint of malice appearing in his eyes. You think you can just walk away? There will be consequences, Eli. Rejecting this family means rejecting everything we stand for. Graham stepped between them, his voice low and filled with conviction. Enough, Charles. Eli isn't your pawn. He's my son, and he'll decide his own future. For a moment, the two men stood face to face, years of resentment and betrayal hanging thick in the air. Graham felt the strength of his convictions solidify within him, knowing he was finally taking back the power that had been stolen from him. Charles turned to the other Whitmore family members, gesturing with a sweeping motion. You see what happens when we let weakness infect this family? Graham threw away his place among us, and now his son follows the same misguided path. But Eli raised his voice, clear and resolute. I'd rather have nothing and be true to myself than be part of a family that values power over people. Your legacy means nothing to me. A tense silence followed, and for the first time, Charles's confidence faltered. He looked at the rest of the family, his allies, who shifted uncomfortably, realizing the growing cracks in the once ironclad Whitmore legacy. With a final defiant look, Eli turned to leave, and Nora and Graham followed. As they walked through the hall, Charles called after them, his voice filled with bitter finality. If you walk out now, Eli, you'll never have a place here again. You'll be disinherited, cut off from everything. Eli paused, looking back over his shoulder. Good. I'm not the Whitmore you thought I'd be. As they stepped outside, the cold air filled their lungs, each of them feeling a weight lifting as they left the estate behind. They had confronted the past, faced down the power of a family that had caused them so much pain, and they'd emerged stronger for it. When they returned to the farmhouse, there was a palpable sense of relief, as if they'd shed the shadow that had loomed over them for so long. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but free from the chains of the Whitmore legacy. That night, they sat around the fireplace, a quiet contentment settling over them. Graham looked at Nora, a small, grateful smile crossing his face. Thank you, he murmured, his voice filled with emotion, for standing by me, for believing in me. Nora squeezed his hand. We're family, Graham, no matter what. Eli looked at them, a sense of peace settling over him as he realized he finally had the life he'd always wanted. A life rooted in love, honesty, and the people who truly mattered. He didn't need a mansion or a fortune to feel complete. This was his legacy now, the warmth of his mother's love, the strength of his father's protection, and the freedom to be himself. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the hearth. For the first time in years, each of them felt whole, the wounds of the past beginning to heal as they looked forward to the life they would build together. In the weeks that followed their final confrontation with the Whitmores, a sense of peace settled over the farmhouse. It wasn't just the quiet of winter coming, with snow dusting the fields and smoke curling from the farmhouse chimney. It was the peace that came from knowing they were finally free. The weight of the past had lifted, leaving them with a fresh start, a chance to build something real and lasting. Eli adjusted to life without the looming shadow of the Whitmore legacy. Though Charles had formally cut him off, he felt relief rather than loss. His father's family had once represented power and status, things he'd imagined might complete him. But now he saw them for what they really were, superficial illusions, empty without the foundation of love and respect that his mother had taught him. One snowy afternoon, Eli joined his parents in the barn, where they worked together to secure supplies for the winter. Nora handed him a bundle of rope, and he took it, his eyes reflecting a quiet contentment. "You know, this feels right," he said, looking around the familiar barn, the beams and walls weathered with years of use. "For the first time, I don't feel like I'm missing anything." Graham gave him a nod, his expression filled with pride. "It's hard to find peace in life, Eli. It took me longer than I'd like to admit, but I finally understand that real strength isn't in power or wealth. It's in knowing who you are and the people you're willing to stand beside." Nora smiled, her heart full as she looked at the two men who meant everything to her. "Family isn't about money or legacy," she said softly. "It's about the love we build and the memories we make together." As they worked, laughter and conversation filled the barn, a far cry from the tension and uncertainty that had once filled their lives. They moved as a team, each knowing their role, each invested in the success of the farm. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, built on honesty and resilience. As evening fell, they returned to the warmth of the farmhouse, where Nora had a pot of stew simmering on the stove. The scent of herbs and vegetables filled the kitchen, and the house felt cozier than it ever had. They sat down around the table, the familiar ritual bringing a sense of comfort. Eli looked at his parents, gratitude filling his heart. "I know we've all been through a lot," he began, his voice steady. "And there were times I wasn't sure where I belonged, or if I even had a family. But sitting here with you both, I know this is home." Graham reached over, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "And you'll always have a place here, Eli. No matter where life takes you, this will always be your home." They ate in comfortable silence, savoring the simple pleasure of being together. It was a quiet evening, but it felt monumental, each of them knowing that this new chapter was one they'd forged with their own choices, not the dictates of anyone else. After dinner, Graham surprised them by pulling out a small wooden box he'd found tucked away in the attic. "I found this while helping Nora organize a few things," he said, setting the box on the table. "Thought we could go through it together." Nora raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I haven't seen that box in years." Eli opened the lid carefully, revealing an assortment of old photographs, letters, and trinkets from Nora's past. They sifted through them together, each item sparking memories, some bittersweet, others filled with laughter. Graham and Eli listened as Nora shared stories of her youth, tales of resilience and love, all the moments that had made her the woman they both admired. As the evening wore on, they found an old photograph of Nora and Graham in their youth, standing together in a sunlit field. The image was faded, but the smiles on their faces were unmistakable, a reminder of the love they'd shared, the love that had endured despite everything. Graham looked at the photograph, a mixture of regret and gratitude in his eyes. "We may have lost time, Nora, but I'm grateful for every second we have now, for this second chance." Nora smiled, squeezing his hand. "Some things are worth waiting for, and sometimes it's the hardest roads that lead us to where we're meant to be." They placed the photograph back in the box, and Graham closed the lid, a sense of closure settling over him. The Whitmores, the inheritance, the betrayal, all of it was in the past now. What mattered was the life they were building together, each day stronger than the last. In the days that followed, their routines became even more tightly woven. Graham and Eli took over much of the heavy lifting, allowing Nora to focus on smaller tasks around the house, and soon, winter arrived in full force. Snow blanketed the fields, and the world around them grew quiet and still. Inside the farmhouse, however, warmth and laughter continued to fill the rooms, each day a reminder of the family they had chosen to be. One particularly cold evening, as they sat around the fireplace, Eli looked up, a glint of excitement in his eyes. "I was thinking, once spring comes, maybe we could expand the farm, maybe even turn the barn into a place for hosting local events. It could be good for the community." Nora's eyes lit up at the idea, and she nodded. "I love that, Eli. The farm has always been more than just land. It's a place for people to come together." Graham grinned, looking at his son with pride. "You've got a good heart, Eli, and whatever we can do to support you, we will." They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming together, envisioning the life they could create in Redwood Valley. It was no longer about escaping a painful past or proving themselves to anyone. They were here, now, because they wanted to be, because they'd fought to be together. When the fire burned low, they each drifted off to bed, and for the first time in years, all of them slept peacefully, free from the shadows of the Whitmore name and the pain of secrets long kept. They'd come through the fire stronger, and each of them felt the truth of it deep in their hearts. As spring finally approached, they stood together on the porch, watching the snow melt away, revealing the fertile earth beneath. The future lay ahead, open and full of promise. They knew that challenges would come, that life wouldn't always be easy, but they were ready to face it together. In that quiet moment, as the sun broke through the clouds and cast a golden light over the farm, they knew they'd found their peace. This was their legacy, not wealth or power, but love, trust, and a family bound by choices they'd made for themselves. No matter what lay ahead, they would walk forward side by side, knowing they'd finally found a place they could call home.